was working, I turned it on. The scripture reading today comes from Psalms 25, verses 4 to 6, and then 16 to 17. And the Word of God says, "Show me your ways, Lord. Teach me your paths. Guide me in your truth and teach me, for you are God, my Savior, and my hope is in you all day long. Remember, Lord, your great mercy and love, for they are from of old. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lonely and afflicted. Relieve the troubles of my heart and free me from my anguish." May God bless the reading of His Word.
Yeah. Right. Well, when you're lonely and afflicted, that's a sad time, because we don't like loneliness, do we? We know how painful it can be. But before I get into that, before I talk about that, I just wanted to bring up one important thing, something important is happening in the life of our church, and one of our members, Len Pierce, retired after 28 years and 1 week with incarceration and parole. I mean, that 28 years and 1 week of doing this incredibly important job, and now a new chapter of your life starting up and opening up. Well, that's amazing. Thank you for your work that you have done for us and for our community, and God bless you. We can't wait to see what comes next and what's in that next chapter. God bless you, man. All right. Well, I have to admit, and maybe you're like this too. You know, in fact, I think I remember talking to you about leaving. One thing is you're going to miss the people. You're going to miss them. You see these people every day. And then once you quit working with people, yeah, you still like them. And you still check in with them, and maybe you come to this or that, but it's never quite the same, right? Because you're not there every single day. And so, yes, this idea of loneliness can come to us. And I've been thinking a lot about that lately, this idea of loneliness and how loneliness can be such a hard thing for us to deal with. And guys, it can be very sad. Actually, this week, as I was thinking about this, on Tuesday, a big article came out in the newspaper about loneliness. And it was actually a survey that Cigna Healthcare did about loneliness. The first thing I asked is, why does Cigna Healthcare care about loneliness? And they said that actually loneliness is one of the things that can make us sick. It's one of those things, they put it up there with smoking and obesity as two things that can make us sick and shorten our lives. And so they're very interested in this. How can we, what is it about loneliness and who's lonely? And so they did this survey, and I guess probably it's not going to surprise any of us. We live in a lonely culture. There are a lot of people that are lonely. They said that they asked, well, do you feel lonely regularly or all the time? And regularly or all the time, 46% of all people feel lonely regularly or feel lonely all the time. And they put it in another interesting way. They asked different kinds of questions, or the same question in different words. And they said 47% said they didn't feel connected. They didn't feel connected to other people. They didn't feel connected to the world. Maybe they didn't feel connected to God as well. And that can cause this profound sense of loneliness. And so one thing this tells us, okay, 46%, almost half, we'll just say half from now on, we'll round up, half of the people in our country feel lonely. Let's assume we Christians are typical of this. There's nothing that separates us. Let's just say, maybe we're a little less lonely, but let's just say we're there too. 50% of us are feeling lonely. This tells us something. It tells us that if we're not lonely, I don't feel lonely. I don't feel lonely regularly. Well, you still probably have somebody you know who feels lonely. You probably have somebody you love who is lonely. And we know that hurts almost as much as being lonely ourselves. Loneliness hurts. It is a pain that we feel. And when someone we love is in that pain, that we feel that very closely to our hearts. I remember 15 years ago, we were being called in, my wife and I were being called in to have our very first ever parent-teacher conference. our little girl who was right here a minute ago, who's 18 now, heading off to school, but college, but now she was 3 years old, and it was her first couple of months in kindergarten, and we were going to our first parent-teacher conference, and it was great. It was one of those conferences that I'm sure most preschool conferences are, a lot of positive feedback, a lot of all the good things, how smart she is in this way and that way, and then at the end of it, the teacher would say, well, there's one little thing, one tiny concern. Okay, she has our attention now. She said, this is something I'm not going to worry about, but just something we're going to pay attention to, is that when all the children go out to recess, they all play with each other on the playground, but Elizabeth comes and she just sits there with the teachers, and she doesn't play with the other children. Well, of course, Leslie's got a master's degree in education. I had gotten my master's degree in divinity. We knew about phases and psychology and other things. We knew this was nothing absolutely to worry about, so we didn't really think about it again for the next couple of months. Oh, that's a lie. That's a lie. We thought about it all the time. It obsessed us. She's not playing with the children. She's sitting with the grown-ups. Oh no, what did we do wrong? What mistakes have we made? Did we change? Should we talk to her about it or not talk to her about it? Well, we don't want to worry her. Maybe she's, and behind all that conversation that went on for a couple of months that Leslie and I had was this need, this thing that comes from kind of our instincts within us as we wanted our child to make friends. We did not want her to be lonely, because we knew what it was to be lonely. And we all understand that. Anyone who loves a child, whether you're a grandparent or a parent, whether you're an aunt or an uncle, whether you're a teacher of a child, we don't want the children to be lonely, because again, we know that it's painful, and we don't want ourselves to be lonely. But here we sit as Christian folk, living in a nation where half the people report this as an issue, as a problem. So what are we to do? What are we Christians to do about loneliness? Well, all right, I approached this a little differently than I would have 15 years ago when Elizabeth was little. I approached this, I wanted to think about, I didn't approach it that differently. First thing I wanted was to know what the Bible says about loneliness. What's God's message to us about loneliness? Now, back 15 years ago, I would have gotten my concordance out, and I would have gotten my Bible commentary out. I would have begun there. I still use those, but I didn't begin there. You know where I began, right? I Googled it. Yeah, I Googled. I want to know what the Scripture said about loneliness, so I Googled simple search, Scriptures about loneliness. Okay, and I bet you all have done a search like this, something like this, and you know that what you get when you do a search like this is you get a bunch of articles people have written. And so there was an article about 16 verses to help you fix loneliness, or 7 verses for you to help you cure loneliness, or 10 verses in your battle against loneliness. You hear that? Right there, we're learning something about what these people who wrote these articles think of loneliness. Right there, we're learning more about them right now than we're learning about what God thinks of it. Because here we have, what is loneliness? It's a battle to fight. What is loneliness? It's an illness to cure. What is it? It's some brokenness to fix. And that's the way approaching loneliness. And we tend to approach it as a problem that maybe we can fix. And so I clicked on the very first one. And I saw that right away, oh boy, I'm going to learn as much about these authors and what they think of loneliness, because they compiled these lists of which verses I should look to. And so right away I learned that this first author, he had, or she, I'm not sure, had a way of dealing with loneliness, because let me read the verse, one of the first verses. Oh yeah, it's, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be terrified, for God is with you, and God will never abandon you. Right? That's similar to our song here. And it's a great place to start. And then it went on, and there were lots of verses like that, kind of like our verse that Ellie read a few moments ago. God, I'm lonely. You need to be with me in my loneliness. You need to help me with this. Help me feel connected to you. And what that is a place to start. Start with God. Start with the recognition that God is always with us. That God will never abandon us. But one thing we have to do, and we have to realize, is that's great. It's one of the great promises of our faith. But it doesn't solve the problem of loneliness. That doesn't do it all, because yes, God gave us this hunger, this desire for his presence, this sense of being alone. If we don't have God in our lives, there's an emptiness in our lives. And God gave us that so we would go toward him, so that we would seek out God in our lives. That's so, and I tell you, we feel close to God, that's taken care of. And God gave us a separate hunger, and that's the hunger, the desire to be with other people, to be connected to other folks. And solving the first hunger doesn't necessarily solve the second hunger. And so here's something I want you all to hear. Here is something I want you to know. You may have a great, close relationship with God. You may feel just connected with God. Your faith may be as strong as it can be, and you can still feel lonely. Don't get down on your faith because you're feeling lonely. We tend to do that. It's strange, but people are ashamed of being lonely. Psychologists report this. They say they'll get people to come in and sit on their couch and tell what's going on in their lives. And people are more willing to admit that they're depressed than to admit they're lonely, because we think there's some shame to that. If we are lonely, one thing we tend to say to ourselves is, if I had more faith, I wouldn't be lonely. Or if I were more outgoing, I wouldn't be lonely. Or if I spent less time, on social media, more time outside, I wouldn't be lonely. We want to blame ourselves for our loneliness. But you see, that can't be true, because everybody in this world is lonely at some point in their lives. It is something that comes to us all. It is not our fault. It is a part of this world. In fact, you can think of loneliness as a gift God has given us. That's strange. We don't normally think of it that way, but loneliness is a problem to solve, right? It's a battle to fight. It's an illness to cure. Well, what if loneliness is something that God has given us to steer us in the right direction? Think of pain. The gift of pain that God has given us. We don't think of that often either. That God gave us this gift of pain because we would get close to the fire and we would go, oh, no, I got pain. I'm not supposed to get close to that. We would fall down and, oh, that hurt. And so when we're next to the cliff where we can fall a long way, we're going to be careful because we want to avoid that pain. That pain pulls us away from things we should avoid. The physical pain. Well, see, loneliness is a social pain. Loneliness is a pain where if we feel it, we think, oh, well, I need to draw toward other people. I need to be closer to them. I need to be more connected to them. We can very much think of this as a gift God has given us. It is not then, and hear this, it is not, loneliness is never something to be ashamed of. And loneliness is not your fault. It's something to know, because we shouldn't feel guilty about our loneliness. And even when we start out with our loneliness by saying, well, we sung so beautifully, where we should start out, you're lonely, God would say, well, just know that I am with you. If nothing else, I am with you. That may not solve the problem of loneliness, because we're still going to hunger for connection to other people, but it is a good place to start. Okay, so that doesn't do it. That doesn't solve loneliness for us. So let's look at the next article on the list. And we open that up and we look at the verses, and it's a lot of verses about helping people who are lonely. And so we go, oh, okay, well, this is a different take. This author is looking at loneliness and seeing it as a call to action for us Christians, as a mission that we can take on in life. And so you will see Jesus telling his disciples very specifically, he will be saying to them, go and find the people who tend to be lonely. Find these groups of people who often are lonely. And so he says, go to the imprisoned. And when you go and visit them, it'll be like you're visiting me. That's what I was telling the kids about today. Jesus saying, go and visit them, and it will be like you're visiting me. Go and visit those who are sick, because they're lonely, sick or lonely, and go and visit them, and then you will feel closer to me. So this says two things, right? This gets us all involved in loneliness. Even the 50% of us who are never lonely, well, we're called to be of service to those who are lonely. And the 50% of us who are lonely, well, we're called to say, oh, One thing I could do about my loneliness is to go out and find somebody else who's lonely and minister to them and get myself out there. I mean, that's one thing Jesus is saying about what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be a human being, in fact, is to be willing to put ourselves out there. And if you're feeling lonely, absolutely do something about it. Get up and do something. Make an effort. And see what you can do about that loneliness. Seeing this idea of loneliness, this problem of loneliness as a call to action. It's something that we can all do. And there are groups that specifically need this. They need, and they do tend to be more lonely. One group that people often talk about is the elderly. And in my experience, that's true. That's what I spend most of my time visiting the sick folks and the elderly folk. And they need that connection. They need those visits. They can be lonely. I read this article just the other day about a city in England, a little town actually. And they knew that they had a lot of older people there in the town, and a lot of them have different needs. So they set up a helpline for folks who are older. And they trained all the people that were answering the helpline to answer lots of questions that anybody might have, but maybe especially people who were older. Health questions, technology questions, questions about the bureaucracy that they have to maneuver through. And they set up this, and it was a huge success. They started getting calls all the time. They started noticing that people were calling with some silly little question, and then they were spending the next 5 or 10 minutes just talking to the person at the other end of the line. Some of them reported that they hadn't talked to anybody for a week. They had not spoken to another human being. And so all of a sudden, the mission of this helpline was altered. It was changed. Yes, they'd still be there to answer questions, but they also included in the training to be able to talk to people, just to be able to listen to them and to respond to them, and in that way to truly be able to be of help to them. And that's, of course, all that it takes when someone is lonely. Just that willingness to connect with them, even for a few minutes, even as little as once a week, and that can make all the difference. So yeah, I hear it all the time. Older folks, there's this epidemic of loneliness. But you know what? That Cigna survey, the big survey, which tells us all about loneliness, they looked at it by age group. And the number one age group for loneliness, was not the oldest folks. In fact, they were kind of a little lower on the list than other people. They were less lonely than even people, in the middle of their lives. The loneliest group, though, were people 18 to 25. People 18 to 25 are the loneliest people. They're always connected. They're always sharing information with each other. They're always passing back and forth. How can they be the loneliest generation? Well, there must be something more than just transferring information. There has to be a real sense of connection. But this goes, what I want to do with this, though, what I want to do with this idea that it's 18 to 25-year-olds, is to point out, we cannot tell who's lonely. We cannot look at somebody and say, you belong to this group, so maybe you're more lonely. Or with this group, and maybe you're not as lonely. That's the mistake we make. We think, well, we can tell who's lonely. We cannot tell who's lonely. It may be the person who has the most loving, attentive spouse. And that's the person who's lonely. It could be the person who's surrounded by many friends, and that's the person who is lonely. It may be the person who has a great, wonderful job that keeps them engaged and they love. That may be the person who is the loneliest. Come to think of it, in your life, as you think of all the people in your life, it could be that the loneliest person is the person you least suspect. I thought about that when I heard this quote from Robin Williams. Robin Williams, he took his own life. Turns out he had a lot going for him. Of course, he had fame, and he had a family, and people loved. He was kind of a beloved celebrity. People who didn't know him loved him. And he said this. He said, I used to think the worst thing in the world would be ending up alone. Yeah. He said, but actually I found out the worst thing in the world is ending up with people who make you feel alone. So you never know who that is. The one who are surrounded by people who for some reason, because of them, because of those people, feel like they are alone. What's an important thing for us to do? To be able to think, You know, we need to be open to looking for loneliness in all sorts of different places. And, you know, again, it doesn't take much. I read yesterday, or heard a thing yesterday that said a woman whose husband had passed away, and she was dealing with loneliness and she was dealing with grief as well. And someone asked her, what is the best thing someone did for you? Okay, this is a question we want answered, right? Because we want to know, well, what do we do for people when they're grieving? What do we do for people when they're alone? Was every week one of my friends on Monday night would call me and ask me if I wanted to have dinner. And I said, no. I said it for several weeks. But she would say, okay, well, I'll call back next week. And she would call back, and she did that for those really hard months. Every week was an invitation to dinner, and sometimes the woman said yes, and sometimes she said no. And that was it. That was the best thing anyone did for her to help her combat her loneliness. We can do that. We can do that, but here's something else we need to accept. You know, that phone call helped. And it was the thing that helped the most. But it didn't cure her loneliness. We can go out, I can visit with people who are alone. I can figure out who those people are if I could and visit with them, and I can visit with them every week. And that would not cure their loneliness. Right? It is still going to be there. We begin to see that maybe loneliness isn't a battle to fight. Maybe it's not an illness that we can cure. Maybe it's not a brokenness that we can fix. Maybe it's the more we fight it in ourselves, sometimes, the stronger it becomes. Well, I've been, as I said, been thinking about loneliness a lot. And the reason I've been thinking about loneliness a lot is because of that little girl who sat on a bench there in preschool and didn't play with the other children for the first few months. Because that little girl now, grown, is going to be heading off to college here in a few months. And I remember, and I know that many of you remember, that being on your own for the very first time can be a very lonely experience. And so I've been thinking about that. And I've been thinking about loneliness. And I've been thinking about those lists of scriptures. And I like them, I tell you. I'm going to do a list of scriptures for Elizabeth as she goes forward into being on her own in some very different way here in these coming months. I would put together a list of scriptures like we talked about today. It would say, you know, first of all, always remember that God is with you. Always remember that. No matter what, at your loneliest moment, you can know that you are never truly alone. And that's a good place to start. But remember, too, that you really need to put yourself out there. You do need to see loneliness as a call to action, both to help those who are lonely and also to minister to yourself by connecting with other people. But then I would want her to make sure she knew that if that doesn't do it, if she isn't cured of her loneliness because she's trying hard to connect with other people, serving other people because she's remembering that God is with her, if all of that still leaves her lonely, then I would want her to know that's okay. Don't be ashamed of that, because loneliness comes to us all. And so there's one more verse I'd like to add to her list. And it may be the most important for her, and it may be for you as well. It's from the Apostle Paul. It's something he wrote near the end of one of his letters. And he was wrapping up this letter. He says this, and it's fascinating. It's kind of I always thought it was a pity. It comes at the end of the letter, because I'd like to know more about this. I'd like him to flesh it out more, but it's about loneliness. It's about hunger, and hungering for the things that we need. And here's what he said. He said, I've learned to be content no matter what I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have much. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and going hungry, of having plenty and being in need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So do you hear this? Contentment, even in the midst of hunger. Whether it's hunger for food or hunger for the companionship of other people. Is it possible then that we can, after we've tried other things, make friends with our loneliness? Is it possible that we can accept our loneliness. And when we accept it, is it possible then for us to quit suffering from it so that we are lonely, but we are not suffering from loneliness? Is it possible for us, like the Apostle Paul, to find contentment even with this hunger of loneliness in our hearts? Yes. Yes, it is. For we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Let us bow in prayer. Loving God, you have given us many gifts, and it is the gifts of joy, the gifts of happiness, the gifts of connectedness. All of these things we give thanks for most often, and give thanks for right now. But loving God, thank you as well for the strange gifts of pain that directs us away from those things that endanger us. And thank you, Lord, too, for the gift of loneliness, because it does have a way of directing us toward other people. Loving God, help us to do all that we can to connect and to feel close to you, and help us to do all we can to feel connected here in this world. Let us not be content with artificial connection, with pretend connection. Let us find real connection in this world and do our utmost. Loving God, help us also, when we inevitably find ourselves alone, to be able to find this contentment Paul has talked about. To be able to, even in the midst of our hunger, to find peace, knowing and having faith in the power of your Son, Jesus Christ, and his love for us. Loving God, you have given us places to go, things to do that can ease our hunger because they bring us together. And none is more important, none is more central in our Christian faith than this table. For this is a table of coming together, of being a family, of being a community. Dear Lord, today, more than ever, help us to focus in on that. Help us to feel it, the connection that these moments of receiving bread and cup bring, that we are communing with you, and we are communing with one another. Loving God, if connection is what we need, help us to feel it as we come here to this table. In Jesus Christ's name we pray.